3 people, 3 unremarkable rooms, 3 lives defined by the weight of what they had not yet achieved. In a small apartment in Hangzhou, a teacher stares at a cold computer screen.
It can't be a coincidence.
In a quiet office in Perth, a designer watches students struggle with tools that do not work. In a cramped San Francisco flat, a man counts the remaining coins in his jar and looks at an empty air mattress. On the surface, there is nothing here but stagnation, but beneath the silence, a shift begins. Each of them holds a thought that the rest of the world calls impossible, a bridge where there is only a gap, a solution where there is only a problem. They are not waiting for permission to change the world. They are waiting for the moment to move. The air in these rooms is heavy with the friction of a decision. It is the quiet before the collision. It is the point where the ordinary ends and the impossible becomes the only path forward. They do not know the scale of what they are about to build, but they have decided that they will not quit. The world is about to change, one room at a time. Jack Ma stood at the front of a classroom that smelled of chalk dust and damp earth. His voice was steady, but the lessons he taught did not seem to reach anyone. Outside, the village moved at a slow, predictable pace, a world that measured success by the harvest and the season.
He had applied for job after job. He had been turned away from every door he knocked on.
The rejections were piling up, each one a sharp, physical reminder that he was not fit for the path laid out for him. He walked home through the narrow lanes, his boots kicking up dust that settled on his skin. There was no grand plan yet, only the gnawing realization that he was standing in the wrong place. He sat at his small wooden desk, the evening light fading into gray. He looked at the wall, then at the horizon, searching for a gap in the fence.
A crack in the foundation of the life he was expected to lead. He was not a man built for silence. He was a man waiting for a signal.
He felt the weight of his own potential, unspent and heavy. He reached out, his hand hovering over the edge of the table, ready to push against the boundaries of his world. The year was 1994. The machine sat on his table, a bulky, humming relic that demanded his full attention. Jack Ma touched the keys, his fingers moving with a deliberate, rhythmic precision. He wanted to see his country, to find a connection to the world beyond the village, so he typed a single word, China. The cursor blinked. The screen remained static. He waited for the loading bar to crawl across, for the index of a nation to populate the monitor. Nothing appeared. No results, no links.
No evidence that his world existed in this new, electric space. The silence of the screen felt louder than the village outside.
He typed it again, slower this time, checking every character, as if a typo were the only reason for the absence. Again, the void. A cold, digital emptiness stared back at him. He leaned back, his chair creaking against the floorboards. Most people would have walked away, seeing a dead end. He saw a map with nothing on it. He saw a vast, uncharted territory waiting for a pioneer. The disappointment vanished, replaced by the sharp, electric clarity of a man who had just found his purpose. He reached out to the screen, his palm resting against the glass, and decided he would be the one to fill the gap. 5 years passed in a blur of frantic planning and quiet preparation. By 1999, the vision had grown too large for one room. Jack Ma opened the door to his apartment in Hangzhou and began to call them in. One by one, 17 people stepped into the small, humid space. The air was thick with the smell of instant noodles and stale coffee. They sat on plastic chairs, on the edge of the bed, and on the floor, their knees bumping in the crowded quarters. He did not give a lecture. He laid out the map of the digital void he had found. He spoke of a platform that would connect the entire country to the global market. He asked for their trust and their savings. The silence in the room was intense, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator in the corner. Then, they began to move. They pulled out wallets and checkbooks, piling $60,000 onto the center table. It was a modest sum, but it represented everything they had. They signed the agreements with shaky pens, their hands leaving ink smudges on the paper. They were not just friends anymore. They were partners in a gamble that defied all common sense. They stood up together, shoulders brushing in the tight space, and looked at the screen. The flickering light of the monitor illuminated their faces as they officially launched Alibaba. The sun rose and set, but the work never stopped. 18-hour days became the baseline. The team lived on instant coffee and the relentless glow of their monitors, their eyes heavy but focused. They were building a bridge, but the world on the other side refused to look. Jack Ma traveled across the ocean, carrying his vision into the glass-walled offices of Silicon Valley. He sat in polished conference rooms, his presentation deck laid out before men in suits who did not understand the market he served. One by one, the doors closed. He received the same polite, dismissive answers that hinted his idea was unworkable.
Or worse, invisible. He stood in hallways, clutching his laptop,
and watched investors turn their backs to take other calls. The rejection was systematic, consistent, and cold. He returned to his team in Hangzhou, his pockets no heavier than when he left, but his resolve remained jagged and sharp. They did not slow down. They took the rejection, folded it into their plans, and pushed back at the code. Every no was merely a variable they had to account for. They worked through the night, their keyboards clacking in a steady, defiant rhythm, ignoring the silence from the west. The rhythm of the keyboards slowed as the money ran out. $60,000 evaporated faster than anyone had calculated. The pile of cash from the apartment was gone, swallowed by server fees and rent arrears. In the Hangzhou office, the lights flickered and stayed dim. They could not afford to replace the bulbs. Jack Ma sat at his desk, staring at a ledger where the red ink outnumbered the black. The phones, once ringing with their frantic outreach, now sat silent. The silence was heavier than the noise had been. He looked around the room. His partners were there, but their eyes held a new question. How many more days could they last? 1 week, maybe less. He picked up the receiver for the call to Tokyo. This was not another pitch. It was the last door. If this one closed, Alibaba would cease to exist by Monday morning.
He walked to the window and watched the rain blur the city lights. He did not sleep. He stripped his presentation down to its rawest core,
removing every slide that did not scream survival. He rehearsed the opening line until his throat burned. There was no backup plan. There was no safety net. He packed his bag, checked his watch, and stepped out into the gray dawn. The air was cold, biting through his shirt, but he did not feel it. He only felt the weight of 17 futures resting on his shoulders. He hailed a taxi. The engine roared to life. He gave the driver the address. There was no turning back. The office was quiet, minimalist, and cold. Masayoshi's son sat behind a desk that seemed to span an acre. Jack Ma stood opposite him, his heartbeat audible in the stillness. He did not recite the slides he had prepared. He did not talk about market projections or profit margins. He spoke about the bridge he was building for millions of merchants who had no voice. 6 minutes. That was all the time he had. Son leaned forward, his gaze dissecting every word. For the first 2 minutes, there was only silence. Son looked at the floor, then at the window, then back at Ma. The air in the room grew heavy,
suffocating. Ma stopped talking, refusing to fill the gap with nervous chatter. He waited.
His hands locked at his sides. Son suddenly stood up. He walked to the center of the room, turned, and looked Ma directly in the eye. He did not ask a question. He made a statement. $20 million. The figure hung in the air, absolute and life-altering. Ma did not cheer. He did not collapse. He simply nodded, his entire posture locking into place. The deal was struck. The void in the market was about to be filled. The survival of Alibaba was guaranteed in the span of a single conversation. With the funding secured, the focus shifted to the consumer. In 2003, the team unveiled Taobao. It was a digital marketplace built for the Chinese buyer, designed to bridge the gap between small sellers and the vast, untapped internet. Across the Pacific, the reaction was swift and dismissive. eBay executives viewed the move with open contempt. They called it a suicidal business mistake, a local project doomed to be crushed by their global infrastructure. They ignored the platform, labeling it an amateur effort that lacked the sophistication of their own systems. Inside the Alibaba office, the atmosphere was different. The team worked through the night, coding under flickering fluorescent lights, ignoring the noise from abroad. They did not look at the reports declaring their failure. They looked at the user data showing thousands of new accounts appearing every single day. Jack Ma walked the rows of desks, his eyes scanning the growth metrics. He knew the arrogance of the giant was his greatest asset. While eBay spent its energy rebranding and imposing rigid global rules, Alibaba tightened its grip on local needs. The mockery from the competition did not slow them down. It fueled their pace. They were building a fortress, while the rival assumed they were still playing with toys. The war for the Chinese market had begun, and the giant had no idea it was already losing. By 2006, the digital landscape had shifted beneath the giant's feet. The arrogance of the opposition crumbled as their global standard failed to translate into the local reality of the Chinese market. Every attempt by the international firm to force its rigid interface and rules onto local merchants met with silence. They were losing sellers. They were losing buyers. They were losing the only thing that mattered: momentum. Jack Ma watched the metrics climb while his rival watched their market share evaporate in real time. The boardroom in San Francisco finally faced the inevitable. They had underestimated the local pulse, and the price was total exclusion. The news hit the wires like a shockwave. The giant was leaving. The retreat was absolute, a full withdrawal from the Chinese market that signaled a new era. The office in Hangzhou did not erupt in celebration. The work simply continued, but the air felt different. The threat that had once loomed over their every move was gone. Ma walked through the rows of desks, seeing the quiet confidence of his team. They had not just survived the onslaught of a global titan, they had outlasted it. The battlefield was clear, the opposition had vanished, and the path ahead was now entirely theirs to command. The years following the victory were not a time for rest. They were a period of relentless expansion. The company matured, moving from a local disruptor to an engine of global commerce. Every rejection Jack Ma had faced in his early years, every closed door in Silicon Valley, and every doubter who had dismissed his vision, now served as a foundation for what was to come. By 2014, the world turned its attention to the New York Stock Exchange. The air inside the trading floor was thick with anticipation as the ticker prepared to go live. This was the moment of reckoning. The numbers flashed across the screens, climbing higher than any analyst had predicted: $25 billion. It was the largest initial public offering in human history, a staggering figure that silenced the final echoes of his past failures. Jack Ma stood before the bell, watching the result of 15 years of work. The capital was not just money. It was the ultimate vindication. The rejection he had once felt was now his fuel, powering a machine that reached into every corner of the global economy. He had started with a single search that yielded 0 results, and now he held the keys to the largest digital market on Earth. The journey from a small apartment to the center of global finance was complete, and the scale of the achievement left no room for doubt. Thousands of miles from the trading floors of New York, the perspective shifted to a quiet classroom in Perth. Melanie Perkins watched the students huddled over their monitors. The air was heavy with frustration. They were attempting to use complex, clunky design software to build simple yearbooks, and the result was a cycle of repetitive clicks and error messages. One student slammed a hand on the desk, exhausted by the sheer number of steps required to align a single image. Melanie stepped closer, looking over her shoulder at the screen. The interface was a maze of menus, unintuitive and dense, forcing the user to fight the tool instead of expressing the design. She saw the students struggling not with creativity, but with the unnecessary friction of outdated technology. She leaned in, tracing the path of a simple adjustment that should have taken seconds but instead consumed minutes. In that moment of observation, the logic of the entire industry felt flawed. Why should design be this difficult? She stood back, watching the students give up on their layout, and realized that a massive void existed in the market. The current tools were built for experts, ignoring the millions who simply wanted to create. The spark was immediate. She did not just see a technical problem. She saw a future where design was accessible to everyone. Melanie did not wait for approval or a massive budget. She started in her own living room, clearing space for a project that would test her core hypothesis. That design could be easy. She chose the yearbook market as her proving ground. It was a complex, paper-heavy industry riddled with inefficiencies that mirrored the struggles she had witnessed in the classroom. She built the first iteration of Fusion Books, a platform designed to streamline the chaotic process of collecting photos and layouts from hundreds of students. Every line of code served as a trial. She spent her days refining the user interface, stripping away the clutter that had paralyzed the students in Perth. When the first school signed up, she did not see just a yearbook project. She saw a functioning machine. The platform worked. The software handled the heavy lifting,
and the students were finally designing without frustration. This was the proof she needed. While the platform served a niche,
her eyes remained fixed on a much larger horizon. She knew that if she could simplify the yearbook, she could eventually simplify the entire landscape of design. Fusion Books was not the end goal. It was the foundation, a physical piece of evidence that her vision was not just a dream, but a viable, scalable reality. Success in Perth was not enough to open the vault of high-stakes venture capital. Melanie began the long, grueling circuit of investor meetings. She walked into sterile offices with a binder of data and a vision for a global platform, only to be met by men who looked at their watches more than her presentation.
She heard the same polite excuses for years. It is too niche, they would say. The market is too crowded, others claimed.
She kept a tally of the responses. 10 rejections turned into 50. Every meeting followed the same exhausting choreography. The firm handshake, the forced smile, the slide deck presentation, and the inevitable refusal. She was told her idea was impractical, that she lacked the experience, and that the timing was simply wrong. By the time the counter hit 100, the rejections had become a physical weight. She sat in airport terminals and hotel lobbies, reviewing her notes, searching for the crack in her logic that everyone else seemed to see. The walls were not just metaphorically closed, they were locked. Each no was a blunt instrument, testing the strength of her resolve. She did not stop. She did not fold. She simply counted the failures and prepared for the next pitch, knowing that if she could not find a way through the front door, she would have to find another way inside. The rejection was not a signal to stop. It was a signal that she was playing on the wrong field. Melanie looked at the data and realized the local venture ecosystem was built for incremental growth, not for the tectonic shift she was planning. She needed to go where the rules were different. She packed her bags and boarded a flight to Silicon Valley. The transition was immediate and jarring. She traded the familiar streets of Perth for the high-intensity atmosphere of Northern California. Every coffee shop, every lobby, and every street corner in Palo Alto held a potential connection to the capital she required. She did not arrive as an established founder. She arrived as an outsider with a mission. She spent her first few days mapping out the networks, identifying the key players, and learning the specific, uncompromising language of the valley. She knew that here, the stakes were higher, and the speed of decision-making was relentless. She was no longer asking for a chance. She was positioning herself in the path of the storm. She walked into the heart of the tech world with nothing but her conviction, ready to do whatever was necessary to bridge the gap between her prototype and the massive capital required to scale it. The hunt was no longer local, it was global. The investor she needed was a ghost in the valley, shielded by layers of assistance and a schedule that never opened. Melanie discovered one constant in his life. He was obsessed with kite surfing.
She had never touched a board, let alone harnessed the wind. It did not matter. She bought the gear, dragged it to the coast, and spent days learning the brutal rhythm of the tide.
she swallowed salt water and took heavy falls, her body bruised by the waves. Every wipeout was a reminder of the goal.
She was not there for the sport. She was there for the 30 minutes of proximity that the ocean provided.
When she finally paddled out, the wind was tearing across the surface, making control nearly impossible. She fought to stay upright, her muscles burning, eyes scanning the horizon for his signature sail. She was an amateur in a dangerous environment, pushing through exhaustion to force an encounter.
She pushed past the fear of the deep water, anchoring her focus on the singular objective.
If she could prove she had the grit to master the surf, she could prove she had the resolve to master the market. She stayed on the water, waiting for the moment the wind would bring them together. The surf calmed, and the distance between them closed. Melanie did not pitch a product. She pitched the struggle.
She spoke of the hundreds of no's and the miles of coastline she had crossed just to reach this point.
The investor looked at her, then at the board, and finally at the tenacity that had kept her upright in the chop. He saw the pattern. In the boardroom, days later, the atmosphere was thick with the weight of the past. Melanie laid out the Fusion Books data, the growth metrics, and the vision for a design platform that would democratize creativity. She watched his hand move across the paper. For the first time in years, the word was not a rejection, it was a commitment.
The ink hit the page, and the cycle of no shattered. 24 months of silence, 3 years of pitching,
and 1,000 miles of travel culminated in a single, definitive signature.
She walked out of the office and into the sunlight, the contract tucked firmly against her side.
The reality of the investment was not just the capital, it was the validation. The market had finally opened its doors. The era of proving herself to others was over. The era of building the dream had officially begun. The capital arrived, but the real work was just beginning. Melanie stripped away the complexity that had paralyzed design for decades. She looked at the tools professionals used and decided that anyone, regardless of skill, should be able to create. She hired engineers who shared her obsession with speed and simplicity. They built a browser-based interface where a blank canvas became a playground. The first few thousand users were a trickle, then a flood. Every day, the servers pulsed with new designs.
Invitations and posters created by people who had never touched a design program in their lives.
She watched the numbers rise, not just as revenue, but as proof. The platform grew at a velocity that defied the skeptics who had once told her the market was too crowded. She iterated, fixed, and scaled, turning a niche yearbook tool into a universal language of visual communication. Where there was once a wall of technical jargon, there was now a drag-and-drop interface. The vision was no longer a pitch deck or a dream. It was a living, breathing utility that millions of people used to build their own ideas. She had proven that the gap between a thought and a finished design could be closed in seconds. The market did not just shift, it tilted. Design agencies that had dominated the industry for years suddenly found their revenue streams under siege. Melanie watched from her desk as the usage metrics climbed, revealing a pattern that no spreadsheet could have predicted. The disruption was absolute. Professionals who once charged thousands for simple layouts found their clients deserting them for a platform that offered the same results for free. In boardrooms across the world, executives who had dismissed her pitch years earlier now scrambled to understand the platform's reach. They looked at the data and saw a void where their influence used to be. The speed of the migration was terrifying to the old guard. Every hour, millions of new projects were started, saved, and shared. Complex software suites that required months of training were being rendered obsolete by a simple drag-and-drop interface. The industry giants were no longer fighting against a startup. They were fighting against a fundamental change in how the world communicated. Melanie kept her focus on the servers, watching the load balance as the entire design ecosystem reorganized itself around her vision. The skeptics were left behind, their legacy systems gathering digital dust, while the world moved forward at the speed of a single click. The numbers on the screen were no longer just metrics. They were a gravity well that pulled the entire tech world into orbit. By 2021, the valuation hit $40 billion. The silence from the once skeptical investors was deafening. They had turned her away with polite refusals, but now they watched from the sidelines as the company redefined the architecture of global design. Melanie walked through the office, a space that had expanded from a modest room into a sprawling headquarters of influence. She did not stop to celebrate the ticker symbol or the headlines. She looked at the screens, at the millions of users currently building their own visions, and saw the scale of the transformation. She had moved from a single yearbook project in Perth to the helm of a massive, industry-defining titan. The market had recognized the worth of her persistence. Rivals, who had once dismissed her as a dreamer, now studied her every move, trying to decode the logic of her ascent. She stood in the center of the floor, a focal point in a machine she had built from nothing. The $40 billion was not the end of the journey. It was the final confirmation that she had successfully rewritten the rules of the game. Melanie pulled a dusty, printed yearbook from a shelf in her office. She flipped through the pages, feeling the texture of the paper beneath her fingers. This was the first product. It was simple, limited, and lacked the power of the platform she led today. Yet, she recognized it for what it truly was. It was not a failure to be outgrown, but a primary school for the massive vision she held in her mind. Every error in that early software, every rejection from a printer, and every late night spent coding in a small Perth bedroom had been a necessary lesson in resilience. She had needed that tiny, imperfect project to build the muscle required for the global company. She looked out the window at the city skyline, understanding that the years of pitching to investors were not just about raising capital. They were about refining the message until it became an undeniable truth. The $40 billion was merely the byproduct of that long, iterative sharpening. She placed the book back on the shelf. The dream had started with a yearbook, but the yearbook had only been the training. The real work had always been about the scale of what came next, and she was only just beginning to see the full potential of that initial spark. Across the Pacific, the world looked very different for Brian Chesky. He stood in the center of a San Francisco apartment that felt too large and too quiet. His pockets held nothing but lint. The rent was 3 days overdue, and the notice taped to his front door was a final, blunt ultimatum. He walked to the kitchen, opened the cupboards, and found only a few packets of oatmeal and an empty jar. There was no safety net. No investors were lining up. No business plan was gaining traction.
He sat on the floor, the hardwood cold against his skin, and stared at the ceiling.
The silence of the room amplified the ticking of the clock, each second counting down toward an inevitable eviction.
He stood up, paced the length of the small living room,
and looked at the corners of the space he was about to lose. He was out of options, out of money, and out of time. He looked at the air mattress tucked into the corner, the only piece of furniture that still belonged to him. He realized then that he did not need capital to start. He needed to stop viewing his OWN lack of resources as a cage, and start seeing it as the foundation of something else entirely. Brian paced the perimeter of the room, his footsteps echoing against the bare walls. He stopped at the window, watching the city traffic blur by below, then turned back to the center of the floor. A thought flickered, then solidified. He would offer the space, not the whole apartment, but the floor itself. He would put the air mattress down, inflate it, and invite a stranger to sleep there for a price. He said the words out loud to the empty room, and they sounded like a mistake. It was absurd. It was the kind of idea that invited laughter or outright dismissal. He imagined telling his former peers, the people who had followed standard paths to success, and he could hear their rejection before they even spoke.
Who would pay to stay in a stranger's living room? The logic felt brittle.
A fragile bridge over a deep canyon of failure. He paced again, faster this time, testing the weight of the proposal. The sheer stupidity of it was the point. If the conventional routes were closed and his bank account was a void, then the only direction left was the one that looked like madness. He stared at the plastic surface of the mattress, waiting for his own doubt to subside, and finally, he nodded. Brian dropped to his knees beside the mattress. The plastic felt cold and brittle under his palms. He grabbed the manual pump, the handle stiff, and began to work it. Each downward stroke was a labor of conviction. He pushed the air into the valve, watching the mattress slowly rise from the floor, shedding its flattened, discarded shape. He moved the coffee table to the wall, clearing a path. He rearranged the chairs, creating a defined space that felt suddenly like a hotel lobby. He stood back and looked at the result. It was just an air mattress in a corner, but in his mind, it was the first unit of a global inventory. He realized that the lack of traditional capital was not a barrier. It was his greatest strategic advantage. He did not need a building, a staff, or a brand name to start. He only needed the empty space he already possessed. He reached for a marker and a scrap of paper, his hand steady. The transition from a desperate tenant to a host was complete. He had no money, but he had a business model that required nothing but a floor, a pump, and the audacity to open his door to the world. Brian sat before an ancient laptop that hummed with a rattling, uneven vibration. He had no budget for a professional site, so he became the developer, the designer, and the architect of his own digital storefront. The code was a mess of trial and error. He typed a line, hit refresh,
and watched the screen blink into a sea of error messages. The server was slow, often timing out just as the page began to render.
He wiped sweat from his forehead and restarted the process. Every pixel was a battle against his own lack of expertise. He stripped away the fancy animations and complex databases, settling for raw, functional text. He needed a form, a button,
and a way for people to see the value of his floor space. The laptop battery flickered, warning him of a power failure.
So he worked faster, his fingers flying across the keys with frantic urgency. The site was ugly. It was rudimentary. It looked like a project from a decade ago. But when he finally hit the save button and the page rendered correctly, he leaned back. It was live. A single, static page representing the entirety of his ambition, waiting for the first user to stumble upon his digital front door. The laptop screen glowed in the dim light of the living room, a beacon of potential in a sea of uncertainty. Brian checked his bank account one last time. The balance was negligible. His rent was overdue, and the local design conference, the only event bringing thousands of visitors to the city, was starting in hours. This was the moment. If he did not get a guest now, he would be out on the street. He paced the floor, his boots echoing against the hardwood.
He heard the distant hum of traffic, the sound of a city that had no idea he was about to flip its entire lodging industry on its head.
He returned to the screen. He refined the listing, emphasizing the proximity to the venue and the low cost. His hands hovered over the keyboard. Every instinct told him it was a gamble that would fail, but he had nothing left to lose. He clicked publish and watched the page refresh. It was official. The listing was live. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked down at the street. People were already arriving for the conference. The hunt for the first tenant had begun, and his entire future hung on the next few hours.
The first sound was a hesitant knock at the door. Brian stopped pacing, his heart hammering against his ribs.
He opened the door to find a man holding a suitcase, looking confused by the map on his phone. Brian stepped back, gesture inviting him inside. The stranger walked past the threshold, eyes scanning the room, landing on the air mattress in the corner. He did not ask for a hotel. He did not ask for a room. He simply asked if the price was correct. Brian nodded. The man pulled a wallet from his pocket, counted out the cash, and placed it on the small kitchen table. The bills felt heavier than anything Brian had ever held.
It was not just currency, it was proof. The guest sat on the floor, checked his bags, and thanked him for the space.
Brian closed the door and leaned his back against it. The air in the room felt different.
The idea that everyone called ridiculous had just become a tangible service. He looked at the money, then at the mattress, and realized the wall between his empty pockets and a global solution had just cracked open. He had his first customer, and the world had its first host. The single guest in the living room was merely the spark. Within weeks, the map on Brian's screen began to light up with dots across San Francisco, then across the coast, then across oceans. The air mattress was no longer a makeshift solution. It was the foundation of a new reality. Brian stopped managing individual bookings and started building a system. He watched the numbers climb as strangers opened their doors to other strangers in cities he had never visited. The skepticism that had once surrounded the idea evaporated, replaced by a surge of global participation. Travelers traded hotel lobbies for local living rooms, finding connection in the spaces between traditional destinations. The platform grew with a velocity that defied every conventional business model. It was no longer about one room or one apartment. It was about the entire world becoming a series of interconnected doors. Brian tracked the expansion, watching as the simple act of sharing space redefined how the planet moved. From a desperate attempt to pay rent, the concept had mutated into a global pillar of travel, stripping away the anonymity of tourism and replacing it with human accessibility. The world was no longer just a collection of hotels. It was now a network of hosts, and the expansion showed no signs of stopping. The numbers on the screen finally stopped climbing. They settled at a figure that defied common sense. $100 billion. Brian sat in the same office space that once felt like a cage, staring at the ticker that validated his most impossible gamble. He remembered the feeling of the empty mattress,
the cold dread of an unpaid rent notice, and the silence of a phone that never rang.
That version of himself had nothing left to lose, and in that absolute absence of security, he had found the grit to build something that changed the landscape of the planet. There were no shortcuts here, only the relentless conversion of desperation into utility. Every rejection he had faced earlier was now a footnote in a massive success story. He leaned back, listening to the hum of a company that had grown from a single room to a global standard. The math was final. By starting with nothing, he had stripped away the fear of failure that paralyzes others. He had gained a seat at the table of history, proving that when you possess nothing, you are truly free to build everything. The company was no longer just a platform. It was a testament to the power of the empty-handed start. Look closely at the patterns left behind by these three. Jack Ma, Melanie Perkins, and Brian Chesky did not succeed despite the rejection. They succeeded because of it. Every door slammed in their faces served as a diagnostic tool, forcing them to refine their vision, sharpen their tactics, and strengthen their resolve. For Jack, the void in the search results was a mandate to build the infrastructure of a nation. For Melanie, every polite refusal from an investor was a lesson in how to articulate a dream that others were not yet ready to see. For Brian, the lack of rent money was not a failure of character, but the very pressure that ignited a global movement. These were not just lucky breakthroughs. They were the results of sustained, high-pressure friction. They treated rejection as a data point, an indicator that they were pushing against the boundaries of the status quo. They did not retreat when the world said no. They used that resistance to build the engine of their own progress. The path to a massive valuation is rarely a straight line. It is a jagged path paved with the echoes of every person who said it could not be done. They turned the friction of the world into the velocity of their own ascent. The stories of Jack, Melanie, and Brian are not outliers. They are blueprints. Look at your own life, at the gaps you see, and at the doors that have been closed to you. Those are not signs to stop. They are signals to start. When you stand in that room with nothing but an idea, you are not at a disadvantage. You are at the starting line of total potential. Most people stay paralyzed by the fear of losing what they have. But when you have nothing, that fear evaporates. You are free to take the risks that others cannot afford. You are free to build, to break,
and to innovate without the weight of expectations holding you back.
Every great shift in history began with someone who decided that their current reality was not enough. Do not wait for the perfect conditions. Do not wait for the validation of the crowd. Use the friction of your circumstances as the leverage to push forward. You possess the same capacity to turn a void into a vision. When you have nothing left to lose, you have finally cleared the space to build everything. The only thing standing between where you are and where you are going is the decision to move. Start today.